What if history's most infamous emperor wasn't born a tyrant, but was actually made into one by the very people he tried to serve? Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into history's most fascinating psychological transformations. Today, we're exploring a controversial theory about Napoleon Bonaparte that might completely change how you see one of history's most complex figures. The man who crowned himself Emperor of France, who waged wars across Europe for nearly 2 decades, who built an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland, might not have started out as the power-hungry autocrat we remember. In fact, Napoleon's transformation from revolutionary hero to paranoid dictator could be one of history's most dramatic examples of how betrayal can fundamentally reshape a person's character. Picture a young artillery officer in 1793, barely 24 years old, passionately defending the ideals of the French Revolution. This was Napoleon Bonaparte at the beginning of his career, a man who genuinely believed in liberty, equality, and fraternity. He wasn't born into wealth or nobility. His family was minor Corsican nobility at best, and he spoke French with a thick accent that marked him as an outsider. Yet he rose through the ranks purely on merit, becoming the living embodiment of the revolution's promise that talent, not birthright, should determine a person's destiny. His soldiers adored him because he remembered their names, shared their hardships, and promoted based on ability rather than connections. He would sleep on the ground with his troops, eat the same rations, and lead charges personally. This wasn't calculated manipulation. Contemporary accounts from his early campaigns in Italy show a leader who genuinely cared about his men and the revolutionary cause. The young Napoleon wrote passionate letters about creating a Europe free from the tyranny of hereditary monarchs. He spoke of establishing republics across the continent, of spreading education and Enlightenment values. When he conquered territories in Italy, he didn't just plunder them. He established constitutional governments, opened schools, and created legal systems based on equality before the law. The people of Milan literally threw flowers at his feet when he arrived, seeing him as a liberator from Austrian oppression. Even his enemies admitted his charisma was extraordinary. One British observer wrote that Napoleon could make men believe they were capable of anything, that they were part of something greater than themselves. This wasn't the behavior of a natural tyrant, but of someone who genuinely believed he was changing the world for the better. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. From the moment Napoleon began succeeding, the established powers of Europe united against him not just militarily but personally. The monarchs of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain didn't just oppose French expansion. They specifically targeted Napoleon as an upstart, a nobody who dared to challenge the divine right of kings. They funded assassination attempts, spread propaganda calling him the Antichrist, and refused to recognize any government he established. When he tried to negotiate peace after his victories, they demanded his personal removal as a precondition. Imagine fighting for your nation's ideals only to have every other nation declare that you, personally, are the problem that must be eliminated. The betrayals weren't just external. Within France itself, the very people Napoleon elevated began plotting against him. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, his foreign minister, was secretly corresponding with France's enemies, selling state secrets and undermining peace negotiations for personal profit. Joseph Fouché, his minister of police, maintained secret contacts with royalists and foreign agents, playing every side while pretending loyalty. These weren't minor functionaries, but men Napoleon had trusted with the highest offices of state. He discovered that while he was risking his life on battlefields, they were already planning for his replacement. The psychological impact of discovering such treachery from those closest to you cannot be overstated. Napoleon once said that Talleyrand was silk stockings filled with mud, a perfect description of the elegant corruption that surrounded him. Perhaps the most devastating betrayal was personal. Napoleon genuinely loved Josephine de Beauharnais, his first wife. Their letters reveal a passionate, almost obsessive love on his part. He would write to her from battlefields, pouring out his heart, calling her his good luck charm. But Josephine was unfaithful while he was away on campaigns, and worse, she couldn't provide him with an heir. The political pressure to divorce her and marry someone who could give him a legitimate successor became overwhelming. When he finally divorced her in 1810, witnesses reported he wept uncontrollably. He had to choose between his heart and his empire, and the choice broke something inside him. After the divorce, those close to Napoleon noticed a change. He became colder, more calculating, less willing to trust anyone completely. The transformation accelerated after the Russian campaign of 1812. When his Grande Armée was destroyed by winter and Russian tactics, many of his marshals and generals began secret negotiations with the enemy. These were men he had made rich and powerful, men who owed everything to him, yet they were ready to abandon him the moment fortune turned. Marshal Bernadotte, once one of his closest companions, became Crown Prince of Sweden and joined the coalition against France. Marshal Murat, his own brother-in-law, negotiated a separate peace to keep his throne in Naples. Each betrayal added another layer to Napoleon's growing paranoia and need for absolute control. By 1813, the man who had once championed Republican ideals had become exactly what he had once fought against: an absolute monarch who trusted no one and demanded total obedience. He created a vast surveillance state, censored the press, and established a hereditary nobility that contradicted everything the revolution had stood for. But was this transformation inevitable, or was it a psychological response to years of betrayal? Modern psychologists might diagnose this as a classic case of betrayal trauma response, where repeated violations of trust lead to hypervigilance, control-seeking behavior, and the inability to form genuine connections. Napoleon began seeing enemies everywhere because, quite literally, enemies were everywhere. The irony is that his increasing authoritarianism created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more he tried to control everything, the more people conspired against him. The more he distrusted his subordinates, the more they sought alternatives to his rule. By the time of his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, even many French citizens were exhausted by his constant wars and welcomed the restoration of the monarchy. The man who had begun as a champion of the people ended up alienating them through his very attempts to protect his power. What makes Napoleon's story so psychologically fascinating is that we can trace this transformation through his own words. His early letters and proclamations speak of glory for France, of spreading enlightenment, of creating a better world. His later correspondence is filled with suspicion, accusations, and demands for absolute loyalty. He went from these signing letters as General Bonaparte, servant of the Republic, to Napoleon, Emperor by the grace of God and the Constitution. The psychological journey between those two signatures tells the entire story of how betrayal can corrupt even the most idealistic soul. Napoleon's transformation raises uncomfortable questions about human nature and power. Was he always destined to become a tyrant, with betrayal simply accelerating the process? Or was he fundamentally changed by his experiences, transformed from hero to villain by circumstances beyond his control? The evidence suggests the latter. Even in exile on St. Helena, Napoleon would sometimes speak wistfully of his early days, of what might have been if only people had trusted him, if only the monarchs of Europe had accepted the new order, if only his allies had remained loyal. This isn't to excuse Napoleon's later actions or the millions who died in his wars. But understanding the psychological journey from idealist to autocrat helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time. How many leaders have started with genuine intentions only to become the very thing they once opposed? How many of us, when faced with betrayal and opposition, might follow a similar path if given similar power? Napoleon's story serves as a warning that even the strongest ideals can be corrupted by the cumulative weight of betrayal and the paranoid need for control it creates. So here's the question for you to consider. In a world where betrayal seems inevitable, how do we maintain our ideals without becoming consumed by the need to protect ourselves from those who would undermine us? The transformation didn't happen overnight. Napoleon's descent from revolutionary champion to paranoid autocrat was a gradual erosion, each betrayal chipping away at his faith in others until only suspicion remained. To understand this psychological metamorphosis, we need to examine the specific moments that broke his trust, starting with the relentless opposition from European monarchies that began almost immediately after his rise to power. Picture Napoleon in 1800, fresh from his triumphant return from Egypt, seizing control of France as first consul. He genuinely believed he could create lasting peace with Europe's old powers. He wrote letters to King George III of Britain and Emperor Francis II of Austria, proposing peace negotiations. The response? Silence from Britain and barely concealed contempt from Austria. These monarchs saw him not as a legitimate leader, but as an upstart Corsican who threatened the very foundation of their divine right to rule. This wasn't just political opposition. It was personal rejection on the deepest level. The War of the Second Coalition continued despite Napoleon's peace overtures. Even after his stunning victory at Marengo in June 1800, where he personally led the charge that turned certain defeat into triumph, the monarchies refused to accept him as an equal. They formed coalition after coalition against him, 7 in total over 15 years. Each time Napoleon defeated them militarily, they would regroup, rearm, and attack again. Imagine the psychological toll of constantly having to prove your legitimacy through violence when all you initially wanted was acceptance and peace. But the external betrayals were only half the story. The internal betrayals cut far deeper because they came from those Napoleon had elevated, trusted, and considered friends. Take Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign minister and one of the most brilliant diplomatic minds of the age. Napoleon had rescued Talleyrand from political obscurity, made him wealthy beyond imagination, and trusted him with France's most sensitive negotiations. Yet, by 1807, Talleyrand was secretly corresponding with Napoleon's enemies, accepting bribes from Austria and Russia, and actively undermining his master's policies. The discovery of Talleyrand's treachery shattered something fundamental in Napoleon's psyche. Here was a man who owed everything to him, yet who sold him out for gold and the promise of survival in a post-Napoleonic world. Napoleon confronted Talleyrand in a famous scene at the Tuileries Palace in January 1809, calling him silk stockings filled with mud, and worse. But what's psychologically fascinating is that Napoleon didn't execute Talleyrand, or even imprison him. Part of him still couldn't believe that someone so close could betray him so completely. Joseph Fouché, Napoleon's Minister of Police, represented another kind of betrayal. Fouché was the ultimate survivor, having served and betrayed every French government since the Revolution. Napoleon knew Fouché's nature, but believed he could control him through a combination of rewards and fear. Yet Fouché maintained secret contacts with the Bourbons, the very royal family Napoleon had replaced. He prepared for every eventuality, ready to switch sides the moment Napoleon showed weakness. Living with such a man in your inner circle, knowing he's constantly evaluating whether you're worth supporting or selling out, creates a toxic atmosphere of paranoia. The military betrayals hurt perhaps most of all. Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, one of Napoleon's oldest comrades in arms, accepted the Swedish throne in 1810 and eventually joined Napoleon's enemies. Marshal Joachim Murat, Napoleon's brother-in-law and one of his most brilliant cavalry commanders, negotiated secretly with the Allies in 1814 to keep his kingdom of Naples. These weren't just political calculations. These were brothers in arms who had shared battlefields, victories, and the dream of a new Europe. Their abandonment struck at the core of Napoleon's identity as a military leader who inspired absolute loyalty. But perhaps no betrayal cut as deep as the one Napoleon inflicted upon himself: his divorce from Josephine in 1809. This wasn't a simple political calculation, but a profound psychological wound that Napoleon never fully recovered from. Josephine had been his anchor, the one person who knew him before the fame, before the crown, before the world bent to his will. She represented his humanity, his capacity for genuine love beyond political calculation. The divorce proceedings revealed the depth of their connection. Both wept openly during the ceremony. Napoleon reportedly said, "God knows how much this decision has cost me," but he convinced himself it was necessary for the dynasty, for France, for the future. He needed an heir, and Josephine, at 46, could no longer provide one. The marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria was purely political, a union meant to legitimize his rule by connecting him to one of Europe's oldest royal families. Yet this self-inflicted betrayal of his own heart changed Napoleon fundamentally. Those who knew him noted that he became harder, more calculating, less capable of genuine warmth after Josephine's departure. He had sacrificed his deepest personal connection for political gain, and in doing so, he betrayed not just Josephine, but his own capacity for authentic human connection. The man who once wrote passionate love letters, filled with vulnerability, now approached relationships as transactions, assets to be managed rather than bonds to be cherished. The psychological impact of these accumulated betrayals manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. Napoleon began to micromanage every aspect of his empire, trusting no one fully. He created elaborate spy networks to watch his own ministers and generals. He would test people's loyalty through elaborate deceptions, setting traps to see who would betray him. This paranoid behavior created a self-fulfilling prophecy where his suspicion and harsh treatment drove away even those who might have remained loyal. Consider the case of his own family members. Napoleon had elevated his siblings to thrones across Europe, making Joseph King of Spain, Louis King of Holland, and Jerome King of Westphalia. Yet each of them, in their own way, disappointed or defied him. Louis refused to enforce the continental system against Britain, prioritizing his Dutch subjects over his brother's grand strategy. Joseph proved incompetent in Spain, losing control of the country despite massive French military support. These weren't just political failures, they were personal betrayals by the very people who should have been most grateful and loyal. The Spain situation deserves special attention because it represents a turning point in Napoleon's psychological state. The Spanish ulcer, as it came to be known, began in 1808 when Napoleon betrayed his own ally. deposing the Spanish Bourbon monarchy to place his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish people's fierce resistance, their refusal to accept French liberation, their preference for their weak Bourbon kings over Napoleon's enlightened rule, struck at his core belief that he was bringing progress and freedom to Europe. The Spanish didn't see him as a liberator, but as an oppressor, and this rejection of his self-image as a force for good deeply wounded his psyche. The transformation was already underway, but it accelerated dramatically after 1810. Napoleon's psychological armor, once built on revolutionary idealism and the belief in human progress, was now reconstructed from paranoia and the need for absolute control. The man who had once declared that ability should be the only measure of worth now surrounded himself with yes-men and sycophants. He created an imperial court more elaborate than anything the Bourbon had ever dreamed of, complete with ridiculous titles and ceremonies that would have made his younger self laugh in disgust. But this wasn't mere vanity, it was a psychological defense mechanism. If he couldn't trust people's genuine loyalty, he would command their obedience through ritual and hierarchy. Consider the continental system, his economic blockade against Britain. When it failed, it wasn't just British resilience that defeated it. It was the betrayal of his own allies and even French merchants who smuggled British goods. His own brother, Louis, whom he had made King of Holland, refused to enforce the blockade properly, choosing the welfare of his Dutch subjects over Napoleon's grand strategy. Napoleon's response? He annexed Holland directly into France and removed Louis from power. The message was clear. Family ties meant nothing if they conflicted with absolute obedience. This wasn't the action of a secure leader, but of a man who had learned that everyone, even blood relatives, would eventually betray him. The Russian campaign of 1812 represents the ultimate manifestation of Napoleon's transformed psyche. Tsar Alexander, once his ally at Tilsit, had betrayed their agreement by resuming trade with Britain. But Napoleon's response went far beyond military necessity. He assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, not just to punish Russia, but to prove that betrayal had consequences. The campaign's catastrophic failure, with barely 40,000 men returning, might seem like military overreach, but it was actually psychological overcompensation. Napoleon couldn't accept that someone he had treated as an equal, someone he had negotiated with face to face, would break their word. The invasion wasn't about strategy. It was about vindicating his worldview that trust was impossible and only force mattered. During the retreat from Moscow, something fascinating happened to Napoleon's leadership style. He abandoned his army, rushing back to Paris to secure his political position. The man who had once shared his soldiers' hardships, who had earned the nickname the Little Corporal for his common touch, now prioritized his throne over his men. This wasn't cowardice, but calculated paranoia. He had learned from Spain that absence bred conspiracy. His marshals might plot, his ministers might scheme, and Paris might forget who ruled them. The transformation was complete. From a leader who inspired loyalty through shared sacrifice to an autocrat who maintained power through fear and presence. The Leipzig campaign of 1813, known as the Battle of the Nations, saw another crushing betrayal. His Saxon allies switched sides in the middle of the battle, literally turning their guns on French forces. Marshal Bernadotte, once one of Napoleon's own generals, now Crown Prince of Sweden, led armies against him. Even Marshal Murat, his own brother-in-law, whom he had made King of Naples, would eventually betray him to save his throne. Each defection reinforced Napoleon's psychological transformation. He became increasingly isolated, trusting only his immediate family and even then with reservations. His correspondence from this period reveals a man consumed by suspicion, seeing potential traitors everywhere because, in his experience, they were everywhere. The first abdication in 1814 might have been a moment for reflection, but instead, it deepened his psychological wounds. The French Senate, the very body he had created, voted to depose him. Talleyrand, his former foreign minister, orchestrated the restoration of the Bourbons. The marshals who owed their fortunes to him urged him to abdicate. Even his attempted suicide failed when the poison he carried had lost its potency. Exile to Elba wasn't just a political defeat. It was a complete validation of his darkest beliefs about human nature. Everyone he had elevated, everyone he had enriched, everyone he had trusted had abandoned him the moment his power wavered. The 100 Days in 1815 represents Napoleon at his most psychologically damaged. His return from Elba wasn't driven by military ambition or political ideology, but by a desperate need to prove that he still mattered, that the betrayals hadn't broken him. But even this final act was marked by paranoia and mistrust. He couldn't fully trust Marshal Ney, who had promised the Bourbons to bring him back in an iron cage but then joined him. He couldn't trust the Chamber of Deputies, who demanded constitutional limitations on his power. He couldn't even trust the French people, whose enthusiasm for his return quickly waned when war resumed. Waterloo wasn't just a military defeat. It was the final psychological blow. Marshal Grouchy's failure to arrive, whether through incompetence or design, seemed like one last betrayal. The Imperial Guard's retreat, those elite soldiers who had never failed him before, shattered his last illusion of invincibility. His second abdication was different from the first. This time, he knew there would be no comeback. St. Helena would be his final prison, but his psychological prison had been constructed years earlier from the accumulated weight of perceived betrayals. On St. Helena, Napoleon spent his final years rewriting history, creating the Napoleonic legend that would influence Europe for generations. But even in exile, the paranoia persisted. He suspected his British captors of trying to poison him. He believed his companions were spying on him. He dictated his memoirs not just to preserve his legacy, but to settle scores with those who had betrayed him. The man who had once inspired such devotion that soldiers would die with his name on their lips now died convinced that everyone around him was an enemy or potential enemy, seeing betrayal even in the tropical winds that eroded his health on that remote island prison. Napoleon's story reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology. Betrayal doesn't just wound us, it transforms us. The young Corsican who once championed liberty, equality, and fraternity became the very embodiment of everything he had fought against. His journey from revolutionary general to paranoid emperor wasn't predetermined by character flaws, but sculpted by the accumulated weight of perceived betrayals. Each broken alliance, each act of treachery, each sacrifice of personal happiness for political necessity added another stone to the fortress he built around his heart. The man who died on St. Helena wasn't the same person who had crossed the Alps or proclaimed the ideals of meritocracy. He had become what he feared most: isolated, suspicious, and ultimately alone. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that in trying to protect himself from betrayal, Napoleon created the very conditions that guaranteed it. His story asks us, how many betrayals can our own ideals survive before we become the very thing we once opposed?